40 years. 40 years is how long the nation of Israel wandered in the wilderness. For 40 years, those 40 years of wandering, that nation of Israel saw God's mighty power in the way that He provided for them. For 40 years, every morning they ate manna, bread from heaven, miraculously provided by God. It appeared outside of their tents every day those 40 years. For 40 years, they ate quail in the evening, again, miraculously provided by the Lord. Imagine that, 40 years. That's longer than I've been alive. 40 years. That's probably, I'm the oldest person here tonight, that's maybe half their age roughly. Can you imagine that? 40 years. Seeing God provide every one of your meals by direct, miraculous intervention. 40 years, an entire generation that grew up, and the only way they knew to receive their daily bread, to receive their meals, was by an act of God. 40 years that happened. But those 40 years were at an end. That's where our first lesson for tonight picks up. At the end of those 40 years, as that nation of Israel was about to enter into that land of Israel, and things were going to change now. Things were going to be different than they had been for those 40 years. No longer was dinner going to appear just outside of their tents, and they just have to step outside and pick it up off the ground. Now they were going to be entering that land of Canaan. And though God was still going to provide for those people, He was going to do it in a little bit of a different way. He wasn't going to miraculously provide their food, but now He was going to involve them in the way that they would get their food. Those Israelites would now have to plant the seeds that would grow in the fields. They would have to go out and they'd have to reap that fruit. They'd have to store it away. They would now be involved in working for their food. And with that change was going to come a temptation. Those Israelites were now going to be tempted to look at the food they ate each day and to think about the way that the Lord provided it to them through their labor, and they would be tempted to forget about God's involvement in how they got that food. They would be tempted to look at all the stuff they had piled up at home and say, wow, look at what I've done. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at all the stuff that I've accumulated because of my abilities and my talents and my skills. And so at the end of those 40 years, before those Israelites entered into that land of Canaan, before they would face that temptation, through the prophet Moses, God gave them a warning. He warned them not to fall into that trap. He reminded them of His great care that they had seen for those 40 years, that they had grown up with, and some of them grown old with. God reminded those Israelites that He would remain the source of all of their blessings, even though He would now use them as a means to give those blessings. And that warning that those Israelites heard before they entered into the land of Canaan, that's a warning that's good for us to hear too. Not because, like those Israelites, this is going to be a new temptation for us, but rather because it's a rather old temptation for us. It's one that we see so often in our lives that, well, it's easy just to go unnoticed. It's easy to not think about. It's easy to go to my job and do my work to earn my paycheck so that I can have my house and my car and my stuff and eat my food. And that sinful nature, it likes to put the emphasis on the mind, doesn't it? Likes to put the emphasis on the me, the I in it. I'm the one who's done all this. I'm the one who worked hard, and that's why I've got all this stuff. There's that temptation to confuse the means with the giver. Because all of that stuff, all of those things that yes, we do work for, they all come from God. He maybe uses our talents and our skills. He maybe uses our time to give those gifts to us. But they ultimately all come from Him. The ability to work, the ability to provide for yourself and for others, those are gifts that come from God. And so as we celebrate Thanksgiving Day, a day when we stop and think about all of those blessings that God has given to us, and maybe especially think about those physical blessings, it's good for us to remember they are all good and wonderful gifts from the hand of our Heavenly Father. A lesson from Deuteronomy chapter 8. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land He has given you. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that He might humble you and test you, to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Then you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the power to get wealth, that He may confirm the covenant that He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. This is the word of the Lord. We'll continue with our next hymn.